The ballroom lights were too bright, and Claire Bennett could feel her heart beating faster than it should for a simple dinner. Something was wrong. She had known it the moment Daniel picked her up that evening, his eyes not quite meeting hers, his smile stretched thin like fabric pulled too tight over a frame. 200 guests filled the grand hall of the Whitmore Hotel, all dressed in their finest, all raising glasses to toast 12 years of Bennett and Associates, the company Claire had helped build from nothing. She recognized faces from years of company parties, faces that had watched her grow from a young bride into a woman who understood contracts and balance sheets as well as any executive in the room. Tonight, though, those same faces would watch something else entirely. Daniel stood at the front of the room, tapping his glass with a small spoon. The sound cut through the noise of conversation, and silence spread outward like ripples on still water. Claire smiled and reached for her husband's hand, expecting the usual anniversary speech, the usual thanks to loyal staff and grateful clients. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Daniel began, his voice carrying easily across the room. 12 years ago, I started this company with a dream and very little else. Tonight, I want to be honest with all of you, because honesty is something I have come to value more than anything. Claire felt a small knot form in her stomach. Something in his tone did not match the celebration around them. "Life moves forward," Daniel continued, "and sometimes the people we need change along the way. I have realized, after a great deal of thought, that Claire is no longer the wife I need." For a moment the words did not seem real. They hung in the air the way smoke hangs before it disappears, and Claire waited for laughter, for some sign that this was a poorly timed joke. Instead, Daniel turned toward the side of the stage, where a young woman named Natalie stood in a deep red dress, her hand already reaching for his. 200 people stared. Some gasped. Someone dropped a fork, and the sound of metal against porcelain seemed impossibly loud in the silence that followed. Claire's face remained still, though inside her chest something had cracked wide open, quiet and sudden, like ice breaking under weight that had been building for years without her noticing. She had spent 12 years building this life beside him. She had spent sleepless nights reviewing contracts at their kitchen table while he slept upstairs. She had planned this very anniversary dinner, choosing the flowers, the menu, the seating arrangements. And now she sat in the audience of her own unraveling, watching her husband announce her replacement in front of everyone who had ever respected her. Claire noticed small details the way people do when the mind refuses to process something larger. The pattern of light reflecting off wine glasses. The way Natalie's dress matched the roses on the centerpiece, as if someone had planned that detail carefully. The way Daniel's hand did not shake at all, meaning this was not a mistake, not a moment of weakness, but something rehearsed. A woman 2 tables away whispered to her husband. A man near the back stood halfway up before sitting again, unsure what to do with himself. Claire's oldest friend, Megan, who had come as a guest that evening, rose from her seat as if to intervene, but Claire caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not here, not like this. Claire had imagined many painful moments in her life. She had imagined losing a parent, imagined difficult days at work, imagined arguments that might one day end her marriage. She had never imagined this particular scene, played out in front of colleagues and clients, dressed up as a business announcement, as though her marriage were simply another asset being restructured. She thought of their wedding day, 12 years earlier, when Daniel had promised to build a life with her, when his voice had shaken with nerves as he said his vows. She thought of the early years of the company, when they worked from a small rented office with a single desk, when Daniel had told her he could not have done any of it without her. She thought of their son, Leo, now 14 years old, waiting at home with a babysitter, unaware that his parents' marriage had just ended in front of a room full of strangers. The silence stretched on, and Claire understood that everyone in the room was waiting for her reaction. They expected tears. They expected her to stand and shout, to demand an explanation, to create the kind of scene that people would talk about for months. Daniel seemed to expect it too, his eyes flickering toward her with something like anticipation, as if he had prepared himself for a fight he could win. Claire set down her wine glass with careful precision. She folded her napkin and placed it gently on the table beside her plate. She looked at Daniel, and for a brief moment, something passed between them that words could not have captured, a silent understanding that whatever they had built together was now finished. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her dress, and turned toward the hotel manager, who stood near the entrance with an expression of stunned discomfort. Claire walked toward him with steady steps, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Thank you for hosting such a lovely evening," she said, her voice calm and clear enough for those nearby to hear. "The room looked beautiful, and the staff have been wonderful all night." The manager, caught completely off guard, could only nod and thank her in return. Claire did not look back at Daniel. She did not glance at Natalie in her red dress, or at the guests whose eyes followed her across the room. She walked toward the exit with the same composure she might have shown leaving any ordinary event, her back straight, her chin level, her expression giving away nothing of the storm building inside her. Behind her, the room remained silent for several long seconds before conversation slowly returned, hushed and urgent, guests leaning toward one another to whisper about what they had just witnessed. Daniel stood frozen at the front of the room, his prepared speech now meaningless. His carefully planned announcement met not with the drama he had expected, but with something far more unsettling: quiet dignity. Claire pushed through the heavy glass doors of the hotel and stepped into the cool night air. The valet, sensing something was wrong, rushed to fetch her car without asking questions. She stood on the curb for a moment, looking up at the dark sky, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way she had once learned to do during moments of high pressure at work. For 12 years she had measured her worth partly through her marriage, through the partnership she believed she and Daniel shared. Standing outside that hotel, she realized something had shifted permanently. She was no longer simply Daniel's wife. She was something else now, something she would have to discover on her own. Her phone buzzed in her small clutch purse. A message from Megan. "Are you okay? I'm right behind you." Claire typed a short reply telling her friend she was fine, that she needed a few minutes alone before anyone else arrived. The valet returned with her car, and Claire slid into the driver's seat, closing the door with a soft click that felt strangely final. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands, staring straight ahead through the windshield at nothing in particular. Somewhere inside that hotel, Daniel was likely explaining himself to confused guests, perhaps laughing off the moment, perhaps already regretting the way he had chosen to end their marriage. Claire found she did not care what he said next. The version of him she had trusted for 12 years had already said everything that mattered. She started the engine and pulled away from the curb, leaving the lights of the hotel behind her in the rearview mirror. Ahead of her stretched a road she had driven 100 times before, familiar streets leading toward the home she and Daniel had built together. A home that would need to become something new now. A home that belonged only to her and their son. Claire did not cry during the drive. She did not scream or pound the steering wheel the way she might have expected herself to, had anyone asked her beforehand how she would react to such a moment. Instead, she felt a strange and unexpected clarity settling over her, as though a fog she had been living inside for months had suddenly lifted, revealing a path forward she had not yet chosen to walk but somehow already knew existed. 12 years of marriage had ended in less than 2 minutes, announced to a room full of strangers as though it were nothing more than a business decision. Claire understood now that Daniel had wanted an audience, had wanted witnesses to soften whatever came next, had perhaps hoped that public embarrassment would keep her quiet, keep her from fighting back. He had no idea what he had actually done. He had no idea that in choosing to end things this way, in front of colleagues, investors, and friends, he had given Claire something far more valuable than sympathy. He had given her clarity, and clarity, she was beginning to realize, was far more dangerous to him than any argument she might have made in private. The house came into view at the end of the street, its porch light glowing warmly against the darkness. Claire parked in the driveway and sat for a moment longer, gathering herself before walking inside to relieve the babysitter and check on her sleeping son. Whatever came next, whatever Daniel had planned for his new life, Claire understood one thing with absolute certainty as she stepped out of the car and walked toward her front door. This was only the beginning. The babysitter, a college student named Priya who lived 2 streets away, looked up from the couch with a smile that faded slightly when she saw Claire's face. Something in her expression must have given away more than Claire intended, because Priya immediately asked if everything was all right. "Everything is fine," Claire said, forcing warmth into her voice. "Leo went to bed without any trouble. He was asleep by 9:30. He said something about a science project due Monday, but I think he finished it before you left." Claire thanked her, paid her a little extra for staying late, and walked her to the door. She stood on the porch for a moment after Priya's car pulled away, looking out at the quiet street, the neat rows of houses with their porch lights and parked cars, ordinary life continuing around her as though nothing had changed. Inside, the house felt different already, though nothing had physically moved. The photographs on the hallway wall, pictures of Claire and Daniel on their wedding day, on vacations in Italy and Mexico, at Leo's birthday parties, seemed to belong to a story that had already ended, even though the people in those photographs did not yet know it. Claire climbed the stairs slowly and paused outside her son's bedroom door. She pushed it open just enough to see him sleeping soundly, one arm thrown over his pillow, his phone charging on the nightstand beside a half-finished glass of water. 14 years old, and still innocent enough to sleep peacefully while his parents' marriage dissolved a few miles away. She closed the door gently and continued down the hallway to the bedroom she had shared with Daniel for over a decade. The bed was neatly made, the way she always left it in the morning. His closet stood open on one side, his suits arranged by color, his shoes lined up with the same precision he brought to everything in his professional life. Claire sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to disbelief, a strange hollow sensation that made the room feel unfamiliar despite having lived in it for years. Her phone buzzed again, Megan calling this time, not texting. Claire answered on the 3rd ring. "I'm at the house," Megan said without preamble. "I'm coming over, don't argue with me." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to, I'm doing it anyway." 10 minutes. Claire did not have the energy to argue. She sat in silence after hanging up, staring at the wall where a framed photograph of their wedding day hung, Daniel in a gray suit, Claire in white, both of them laughing at something just out of frame. She wondered briefly whether he had already been planning tonight's announcement for weeks, whether the smile in that photograph had been the last honest moment of their marriage or simply the beginning of a performance that had lasted 12 years. Megan arrived exactly 10 minutes later, letting herself in with the spare key Claire had given her years ago for emergencies. She found Claire still sitting on the edge of the bed and immediately crossed the room to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders without a word. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Megan had known Claire since college, had stood beside her at her wedding, had watched their friendship survive career changes, house moves, and the ordinary distances that sometimes grow between people over the years. She was, in many ways, the closest thing Claire had to family outside of her own son. "I don't even know what to say," Megan finally admitted. "I've never seen anything like that in my life. Who does that? Who stands up in front of 200 people and does that?" "Someone who wanted witnesses," Claire said quietly. "Someone who wanted to control how the story got told." Megan pulled back slightly to look at her friend's face. "You're being remarkably calm about this." "I'm not calm, I'm somewhere past calm. I don't know what to call it." Megan nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation. She had seen Claire handle difficult situations before, during a lawsuit against the company years earlier, during her mother's long illness, during countless smaller crises that came with running a business and raising a family. Claire had always been the person who thought clearly under pressure, who found solutions while others panicked. Tonight seemed to be no different, even though the stakes felt impossibly higher. "What are you going to do?" Megan asked. Claire considered the question carefully before answering. "Tonight, nothing. Tonight I'm going to sleep if I can, and tomorrow I'm going to figure out what comes next. You know, people are already talking. By tomorrow morning, half the company will know, probably half the city. I know. Some of them are going to feel sorry for you. Some of them are going to think you must have done something to deserve this. Claire's expression hardened slightly. Let them think whatever they want. I know the truth, and eventually so will they. Megan studied her friend for a long moment, sensing something shifting beneath the surface of her calm exterior, something that had not fully revealed itself yet, but was clearly beginning to take shape. You're planning something already, aren't you? I'm not planning anything yet, I'm thinking. That's usually how it starts with you. Claire allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuine expression to cross her face since leaving the hotel. 12 years, Megan. 12 years of building that company alongside him, of signing documents, of putting my name on contracts and loan applications. He seems to have forgotten that I was never just his wife sitting at home. I was his partner in every sense of the word. Do you think he'll try to push you out of the business? I think he's already decided to. I think tonight was the first move in a plan he's been putting together for a while. Megan's expression turned serious. Then you need a lawyer, not eventually, now, tomorrow morning. I know. I mean it, Claire. Whatever is coming, you need someone in your corner who understands contracts and business law better than either of us. Claire nodded, already turning the problem over in her mind, already beginning to separate her emotions from the practical steps that lay ahead. She thought of Grace Whitfield, a lawyer she had met years earlier at a business conference, a woman known throughout the city for her sharp mind and her refusal to back down from difficult cases. Claire had exchanged business cards with her once, had followed her career with mild professional interest, never imagining she would someday need her services in such personal circumstances. I know who to call, Claire said finally. Megan stayed another hour, making tea neither of them drank, sitting with Claire in comfortable silence as the adrenaline of the evening slowly faded into exhaustion. Around midnight, she finally left, promising to check in first thing in the morning, reminding Claire that she was not alone in whatever came next. After Megan left, Claire changed out of her dress and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, studying her own reflection as though searching for some sign of the woman she had been just hours earlier, before the toast, before the announcement, before the quiet walk out of that ballroom. She looked the same. Tired, perhaps, but the same woman who had walked into that hotel believing she was celebrating 12 years of partnership and love. She thought about Daniel, wondering where he was at that moment, whether he had gone home with Natalie, whether he felt any guilt at all about the way he had chosen to end their marriage. She thought about the guests at the dinner, about the whispered conversations that were surely still happening across the city, about the version of tonight's story that would spread by morning, shaped by whoever told it first. Claire climbed into bed alone for the first time in over a decade, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around her. She did not cry, though she had expected to. Instead, she found herself making a mental list, the same way she approached any difficult problem at work. Identify what she knew, identify what she needed to find out, and identify the first step forward. She knew that Daniel had been planning this for some time. She knew that Natalie had likely been part of his life for longer than tonight suggested. She knew that the company, the home, and their son's future were all now uncertain in ways they had not been 24 hours earlier. What she did not know, not yet, was how deep the deception truly ran, or what secrets Daniel had been hiding behind his calm and confident announcement. She did not know that the calculations he had made that evening, the careful staging, the presence of witnesses, had been designed not simply to end their marriage but to protect something else entirely, something Claire had not yet begun to suspect. Sleep did not come easily that night, but eventually exhaustion won out over the racing thoughts in her mind. Claire drifted into an uneasy rest sometime after 2 in the morning, unaware that the following weeks would reveal far more about her husband's betrayal than she could have imagined sitting in that ballroom. watching him introduce another woman as though Claire herself had simply become obsolete. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the curtains, and with it came the first true test of the new life Claire now faced. Leo would wake soon, expecting breakfast and ordinary conversation, unaware that everything had changed. Claire rose from bed, splashed cold water on her face, and prepared herself to become, for the first time in her life, the only parent standing at the center of her son's world. Whatever came next, she understood she could not afford to fall apart. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what she was truly facing. Leo came downstairs at 7:30, backpack already slung over one shoulder, hair still messy from sleep. He grabbed a bowl from the cabinet and poured cereal without looking up, the ordinary rhythm of a school morning carrying on as though the world had not shifted overnight. "Where's Dad?" he asked, glancing toward the empty chair at the kitchen table. Claire kept her voice steady as she poured orange juice into a glass. "He had an early meeting. He'll probably be home later tonight." Leo accepted this without question, the way 14-year-olds often accept small inconsistencies in their parents' schedules, more interested in his phone than in the details of his father's whereabouts. Claire watched him eat, memorizing the ordinary comfort of the moment, aware that it might be one of the last mornings before Leo learned the truth about what had happened at the hotel. After dropping him at school, Claire drove home slowly, taking the long way through familiar streets, giving herself time to think before facing the empty house and the decisions that awaited her there. Her mind kept returning to the beginning, to the early years with Daniel, searching for some sign she might have missed, some warning she had failed to recognize. She had met Daniel Bennett 15 years earlier, at a mutual friend's birthday party in a small apartment that smelled of cheap wine and candle smoke. He had been 28 then, ambitious and full of ideas about starting his own consulting firm, talking with the kind of confidence that made people lean in closer to listen. Claire, 26 at the time and working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown, had found herself drawn to his energy, to the way he spoke about the future as though it were already decided in his favor. Their courtship had been quick but not reckless. Within a year they were engaged, and within 2 years married, moving into a small apartment together, while Daniel worked long hours trying to build his consulting business from almost nothing. Claire had continued working at her own job during those early years, but she also spent countless evenings helping Daniel review contracts, draft proposals, and manage the finances of his growing company. It had felt at the time like a genuine partnership, two people building something together with equal investment and equal stakes. By the time Leo was born, 5 years into their marriage, Bennett and Associates had grown into a respected consulting firm with a dozen employees and a steady client base. Claire had officially joined the company 2 years after that, taking on the role of operations director, her name appearing on official documents alongside Daniel's as co-owner of the business they had built together. Looking back now, driving through streets she had traveled 1,000 times before, Claire tried to identify the moment things had begun to change. There had not been one single dramatic event, she realized, but rather a slow accumulation of small shifts that she had noticed and then quickly dismissed, telling herself she was imagining things, telling herself that busy people sometimes grew distant without meaning anything by it. The late nights had increased over the past year, Daniel claiming meetings that ran longer than expected, client dinners that kept him out until midnight. Claire had noticed the changes, but attributed them to the pressures of running a growing company, never suspecting anything beyond ordinary professional demands. There had been a business trip to Chicago 4 months earlier, a trip Daniel described as essential for securing a major new client. Claire remembered feeling a small flicker of unease when she noticed he had packed an unusually formal wardrobe for what was supposedly a routine meeting, but she had dismissed the thought as quickly as it arrived. Unwilling to entertain suspicions, she had no real evidence to support. She remembered, too, a moment several months earlier when Daniel's phone had buzzed repeatedly during dinner, and he had excused himself to take the call in another room, returning with an explanation about a difficult client that Claire had accepted without question. In hindsight, these small moments formed a pattern she had been too trusting, or perhaps too distracted by the demands of running a household and raising a son, to fully recognize. The most troubling memory surfaced as Claire pulled into her driveway and sat with the engine off, staring at the closed garage door. 3 months earlier, she had found a receipt in Daniel's jacket pocket while doing laundry, a receipt from a jewelry store for an item she had never received. When she asked him about it, he had explained smoothly that it was a gift for his sister's birthday, something Claire had no reason to doubt at the time, though she now wondered whether that explanation had been another carefully constructed lie. Claire walked into the house and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she did not drink, her laptop open in front of her. She had decided during the drive home that she needed to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with before making any decisions about how to move forward. Emotional reactions could wait. What she needed now was information. She began with something simple, searching Daniel's name alongside Natalie's, curious whether any public trace existed of their relationship before last night's announcement. The search returned little of immediate use, though she did find a photograph on a professional networking site showing Daniel and Natalie together at an industry conference 8 months earlier, both smiling for the camera in a way that suggested more familiarity than a simple business acquaintance would typically show. Claire studied the photograph for a long time, noting the way Natalie's hand rested lightly on Daniel's arm, the way their bodies leaned slightly toward one another. 8 months. If this photograph accurately reflected the beginning of their relationship, then Daniel had been living a double life for the better part of a year, all while continuing to share a home, a bed, and a business with Claire. She closed the laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes, allowing herself a brief moment of raw emotion before forcing herself back into a state of practical focus. Anger would not help her now. Grief could wait until she had secured her own future and her son's stability. What she needed was clarity, and clarity required facts. Claire spent the rest of the morning making a list of everything she needed to investigate. The company's financial records, which she had trusted Daniel to manage more closely over the past 2 years as her role shifted toward client relations. The joint accounts they shared, which she had not reviewed in detail for several months, assuming Daniel's management of their finances was as straightforward as it had always been. The house, which was held in both their names, along with several other assets accumulated over 12 years of marriage. She thought about calling Grace Whitfield immediately, but decided to wait one more day, wanting to gather as much information as possible on her own before bringing in outside help. She understood, from years of running a business, that the strongest position in any negotiation came from knowledge, and right now, she possessed dangerously little of it regarding her own husband's recent activities. Her phone rang around noon. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and Claire stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Claire?" His voice sounded different than it had the night before, less confident, almost cautious. "We need to talk." "We can talk," Claire said evenly, "though I'm not sure what's left to discuss after last night. I know that wasn't handled well. I know I should have spoken with you privately first. I got caught up in trying to be honest and it came out wrong." Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of the apology, the way he seemed to believe the problem had simply been one of poor timing rather than the fundamental betrayal itself. "You announced the end of our marriage to 200 people, Daniel. There isn't really a right way to have done that." A pause stretched across the line. "I want to handle things fairly. I want us to figure out the company, the house, everything, in a way that works for both of us and for Leo." "I appreciate that sentiment," Claire replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I'll be speaking with a lawyer this week to make sure everything is handled properly and fairly, as you say." Another pause, longer this time. "You don't need to bring lawyers into this. We can work it out between us. That's always been how we do things." Claire felt something harden inside her chest, a resolve settling into place that had not fully formed until that very moment. That was how we did things when I believed we were partners, Daniel. I'm not sure that's true anymore." She ended the call before he could respond, setting the phone down on the table with a hand that trembled slightly despite her outwardly calm demeanor. The conversation confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. Daniel wanted to avoid formal legal involvement, wanted to keep the dissolution of their marriage and their business as informal and quiet as possible. That desire, Claire realized, likely had less to do with sentiment and more to do with something he did not want discovered. A man confident in his own fair dealing would not fear lawyers. A man with something to hide would want to keep everything as private and uncontested as possible. Claire opened her laptop again and began compiling a more detailed list of financial records she needed to access, documents she needed to request, and questions she needed answered before her scheduled meeting with Grace Whitfield later that week. She thought of Leo, currently sitting in a classroom unaware of the changes unfolding around him, and felt a fierce determination settle over her exhaustion and grief. Whatever Daniel had built with Natalie over the past several months, whatever plans he had made for a future without Claire in it, she intended to understand every detail before allowing him to walk away with anything that was not rightfully his. The calm composure she had shown at the hotel the night before had not been an act of surrender. It had been the first careful move in a much longer game, one Daniel had not yet realized he was playing. By the time evening arrived and Leo returned home from school, chattering about a basketball tryout and a difficult math test, Claire had already scheduled her meeting with Grace for 2 days later. She had also begun quietly documenting everything she remembered from the past year, every late night, every unexplained absence, every small detail that now seemed significant in light of what she had learned. She served dinner and listened to her son talk about his day, offering the same warm attention she always gave him, though her mind continued working in the background, piecing together a picture of the year she had missed while trusting her husband completely. Leo asked again where his father was, and Claire told him gently that his parents needed to talk about some grown-up things, that everything would be explained soon, that he should not worry. After Leo went to bed, Claire sat alone in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the life she had built, and made a promise to herself. She would not fall apart in front of her son. She would not allow Daniel's betrayal to define the rest of her life. And she would not stop until she understood exactly what he had been hiding and exactly what it would cost him. Grace Whitfield's office occupied the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, with windows overlooking the river and shelves lined with law books that looked as though they had actually been read rather than displayed for effect. Claire arrived 10 minutes early, folder of documents tucked under her arm, and found Grace already waiting, standing by the window with 2 cups of coffee prepared. "I remember you," Grace said, extending a hand. "The finance conference 3 years ago, you asked the sharpest question in the entire session about liability structures." Claire managed a small smile despite her nerves. "I didn't expect you to remember that." "I remember people who ask good questions. Sit down. Tell me what happened." Claire spent the next 20 minutes recounting the events of the dinner, the announcement, Daniel's phone call the following day, and her growing suspicion that something beyond a simple affair was at play. Grace listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression giving away little until Claire finished speaking. "First," Grace said, setting down her pen, "I want you to understand that what he did at that dinner, while cruel and calculated, does not by itself change your legal rights. You are still his wife. You still hold whatever ownership stake you have in the company. Nothing about last night automatically strips you of anything." "That's a relief to hear." "But," Grace continued, "the way he handled the announcement, the public nature of it, the presence of another woman he seems to have already introduced into his life, tells me something important. Men who plan carefully staged endings usually do so because they believe they have already secured their position. I want to know what position he thinks he secured." Claire pulled the folder from under her arm and spread its contents across the desk. Printouts of the company's public financial filings, copies of joint account statements from the past 6 months, and the photograph she had found of Daniel and Natalie at the conference 8 months earlier. Grace studied each document carefully, her expression sharpening as she moved through the financial statements. Who has primarily managed the company's books for the past 2 years? Daniel has, mostly. I shifted more toward client relations after Leo started needing more attention at school. I still review quarterly summaries, but the day-to-day bookkeeping has been his responsibility. And these joint accounts, when did you last review the detailed transaction history, not just the balance? Claire hesitated. Honestly, probably close to a year ago. I trusted the summaries he showed me. Grace nodded slowly, the way a doctor might nod after confirming a suspected diagnosis. Claire, I want to be direct with you. In my experience, when someone goes to significant effort to end a marriage publicly and dramatically, especially when that person has controlled the finances of a shared business, there is often something underneath that they are trying to obscure through the emotional chaos of the moment. I'm not saying that's definitely what's happening here, but I think it's worth investigating before we move forward with anything else. What would that investigation look like? I have a forensic accountant I work with regularly on cases like this. Her name is Preeti Sharma. With your authorization, since you're a co-owner of the company, she can request a full audit of the company's financial records for the past 2 years. If anything is out of order, she'll find it. Claire felt a mixture of dread and determination settle over her. Do it. Grace made a note and looked up. This process can take a few weeks. In the meantime, I recommend we file the appropriate paperwork to formally begin separation proceedings, which will also help protect your interests in the joint accounts and prevent any further asset transfers without your knowledge. Has he moved any significant funds recently that you're aware of? I don't know. That's part of what worries me. Then let's find out. Grace picked up her phone and made a call, arranging for a temporary financial hold to be requested on the joint accounts, a standard legal step meant to prevent one spouse from draining shared resources during separation proceedings. Claire listened, grateful for someone else's steady expertise guiding her through unfamiliar territory. 3 days later, Claire met Preeti Sharma at a small conference room near Grace's office, files and laptops spread across the table between them. Preeti was younger than Claire expected, perhaps in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a manner of speaking that suggested she rarely wasted words. I've gone through the past 18 months of company records, Preeti began without preamble. There are irregularities, several of them. Claire's stomach tightened. What kind of irregularities? Preeti turned her laptop toward Claire and pulled up a spreadsheet filled with categorized transactions. There's a pattern of payments to a consulting entity called Ridgeline Solutions, beginning approximately 10 months ago. These payments total just over $140,000 over that period, categorized in the company books as external consulting fees. I've never heard of Ridgeline Solutions. That's not surprising, because it doesn't appear to actually exist as a legitimate operating business. I traced the registration. It was formed 11 months ago by a woman named Natalie Ashford. The name landed like a physical blow. Claire had known, intellectually, that Daniel's relationship with Natalie had likely been ongoing for many months, but seeing it confirmed through cold financial records, through actual company money quietly diverted into an entity bearing her name, made the betrayal feel newly devastating. He's been paying her through the company, Claire said slowly, working through the implications, using client funds disguised as consulting fees. That appears to be exactly what happened, Preeti confirmed. There are also several smaller transactions that don't have clear business justification. A luxury apartment lease payment routed through a company expense account. Airline tickets for destinations that don't correspond to any client meetings on the company calendar. Jewelry purchases categorized as client gifts, though there's no record of which clients received them. Grace, who had been reviewing a separate set of documents, looked up. This is significant, Claire. What we're looking at isn't simply a personal betrayal. This is potential embezzlement from a company you co-own, which means it's also theft from your own financial interests. And depending on how client contracts are structured, it could constitute fraud against clients whose fees were misappropriated for personal use. Claire sat back in her chair, absorbing the full weight of what she was hearing. The affair itself had been painful enough to process. This new information transformed the situation entirely, revealing not just infidelity, but a calculated financial betrayal that had likely been unfolding for nearly a year, hidden behind spreadsheets and expense reports Claire had trusted without close examination. "How much total?" she asked quietly. Preeti consulted her notes. "Based on what I've identified so far, approximately $230,000 in questionable transactions over the past 11 months. I want to emphasize that this is a preliminary figure. A more thorough audit may reveal additional discrepancies." Claire closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. When she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression, the raw grief of the past days giving way to a colder, more focused determination. "What are my options?" she asked. Grace leaned forward. "Given what Preeti has found, you have several paths available. We can pursue this purely through civil proceedings related to your divorce and business dissolution, seeking to recover these funds as part of the settlement. Alternatively, depending on how thoroughly this rises to the level of fraud against the company and potentially against clients, there may be grounds to involve law enforcement, though that path carries its own complications and timeline. What would you recommend?" "I recommend we proceed carefully and strategically. Right now, Daniel does not know we've discovered this. That gives us an advantage. I suggest we complete the full audit, secure all necessary documentation, and then approach negotiations from a position of complete knowledge. If he attempts to lowball you on the settlement or push you out of the company without fair compensation, we will have more than enough leverage to ensure that doesn't happen." Claire nodded slowly, feeling the shape of a plan beginning to form, one built not on anger or revenge, but on the same careful strategic thinking she had applied throughout her career whenever the company faced a difficult problem. "How long until the full audit is complete?" "Give me 2 more weeks," Preeti said. "I want to trace every transaction back to its source, and make sure we have a complete and defensible picture before you sit down with him again." Claire thanked them both and gathered her things, her mind already racing ahead to the weeks that lay before her. She would need to continue functioning normally at work, continue caring for Leo, continue maintaining the appearance of composure that had already surprised everyone who witnessed her reaction at the hotel, all while carrying the knowledge of exactly what Daniel had done, and exactly what he stood to lose once the truth became undeniable. Driving home that evening, Claire found herself thinking not of anger but of a strange, quiet resolve. Daniel had spent the past year building a hidden life funded by money that belonged to their shared company, believing himself clever enough to hide it behind careful bookkeeping and a well-timed public announcement designed to control the narrative before anyone could look closer. He had underestimated her, Claire realized, in the same way people often underestimated quiet composure, mistaking calm for weakness rather than recognizing it for what it truly was. The discipline required to think clearly while everything around her had been designed to make her fall apart. The 2 weeks that followed tested Claire in ways she had not anticipated. On the surface, life continued with an unsettling normalcy. She drove Leo to school each morning, attended to client calls at the office, prepared dinner most evenings, and maintained the same steady presence her son had always known. Beneath that surface, however, she carried the growing weight of what Preeti Sharma continued to uncover, each new discovery adding another layer to the picture of Daniel's deception. Daniel had moved out of the house within the first week, taking a small collection of belongings and leaving the rest, presumably assuming he would return later to negotiate a fuller division of their shared property. He called occasionally, his tone shifting between conciliatory and impatient depending on the day, pushing gently for a quick and informal resolution to what he continued to characterize as an unfortunate but manageable situation. Claire kept her responses brief during these calls, careful not to reveal how much she and her legal team had already discovered. She had learned, over years of business negotiations, that the person who reveals their full hand first often loses whatever advantage they might have held. She intended to hold her hand close until the moment came to reveal it completely. Leo noticed his father's absence, of course, and Claire found herself navigating careful conversations about why his parents needed time apart, why dinners now happened with just the two of them, why the house felt quieter than it once had. She kept these explanations simple and age-appropriate, careful not to burden her son with details he did not yet need to carry, though she knew a fuller conversation would eventually become necessary. At the office, whispers followed Claire through hallways that had once felt entirely comfortable and familiar. Employees who had worked alongside her for years now seemed uncertain how to behave, some offering awkward sympathy, others avoiding eye contact altogether, unsure whether acknowledging the situation would be welcome or intrusive. Claire handled each interaction with the same measured composure she had shown at the hotel, refusing to let the company's daily operations suffer because of her personal circumstances. Her business partner in the operational side of the company, a longtime colleague named Henry Acaffer, approached her privately during the second week, closing her office door behind him before speaking. "I don't know exactly what's happening between you and Daniel," Henry said carefully, "and it's not my business to ask, but I've noticed some strange approvals coming through the finance department over the past year, things that didn't quite add up when I reviewed them. I assumed it was nothing, but given everything that's happened, I wanted you to know I noticed." Claire studied her longtime colleague, weighing how much to reveal. Henry had been with the company since its early years, had helped grow it alongside both Claire and Daniel, and had always struck her as a person of genuine integrity. "What kind of approvals?" she asked carefully. "Consulting invoices, mostly. Amounts that seemed disproportionate to the work described, approved directly by Daniel without going through the usual review process. I mentioned it to him once, months ago, and he told me it was a specialized vendor relationship he was personally managing. I didn't push further because, frankly, it wasn't my place to question his judgment on vendor relationships." Claire nodded slowly. "Henry, I appreciate you telling me this. I'm working with legal counsel to understand the full scope of some financial irregularities. I may need your cooperation at some point, providing documentation or confirming certain processes within the company." Henry's expression shifted from cautious to visibly concerned. "This is more serious than I realized, isn't it?" "It's serious," Claire confirmed. "I can't share all the details yet, but I want you to know that whatever comes next, the company itself, the work you and I and everyone here have built, is not going to be compromised. I intend to protect that, regardless of what happens between Daniel and me personally." Henry left her office looking troubled but reassured by her confidence, and Claire found his testimony, however small, adding another piece to the growing case Grace and Preeti were assembling on her behalf. The following week, Preeti called requesting an in-person meeting, her voice carrying an urgency that had not been present in their previous conversations. Claire arranged childcare for Leo and drove to Grace's office that afternoon, her hands tight on the steering wheel throughout the drive, bracing herself for whatever new revelation awaited. "I found something significant," Preeti said once Claire had settled into the conference room. She turned her laptop around, displaying a series of wire transfer records. Ridgeline Solutions received a transfer of $80,000 4 months ago, categorized in the company books as an advance payment for a consulting project related to the Meridian account, one of your largest clients. "I remember approving budget for Meridian consulting support," Claire said slowly, trying to recall the details. "Daniel told me they needed additional market research capacity." "There was no additional market research conducted," Preeti confirmed. "I contacted a colleague who has done legitimate work for Meridian in the past, without revealing the specifics of this situation, and confirmed that no third-party research firm was involved in their account during that period." The $80,000 appears to have gone directly toward a down payment on a condominium, purchased under Natalie Ashford's name 3 months ago. Claire absorbed this information silently, feeling something cold settle in her chest. Daniel had not simply diverted funds toward gifts or shared expenses with Natalie. He had used company money generated in part from a client relationship Claire herself had helped cultivate over several years, to purchase real estate for the woman with whom he had been having an affair. "There's more," Preeti continued, her voice gentle but direct. "I found evidence that Daniel has been in preliminary conversations with a business broker about potentially selling his stake in the company, or restructuring the ownership agreement in a way that would reduce your controlling interest. These conversations began approximately 6 weeks ago, which suggests he was planning this transition well before the announcement at the anniversary dinner." Grace, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "This confirms what I suspected from the beginning. The public nature of the breakup wasn't simply cruelty or poor judgment on Daniel's part. It was strategic. He likely believed that a dramatic, embarrassing public ending would leave you too emotionally devastated, and too concerned about protecting your reputation to fight aggressively for your rightful share of the business and the misappropriated funds." Claire felt anger rising within her for the first time since the night of the dinner, a controlled but unmistakable fury at the calculated nature of what Daniel had done. He had not simply fallen in love with someone else, a painful but understandable human failing that she might, in another circumstance, have found a way to forgive or at least accept with dignity. He had systematically planned to use their shared company's resources to fund a secret second life, and then attempted to use public humiliation as a tool to weaken her position before she could discover the truth. "What's our next step?" Claire asked, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "I want to complete a few final verifications," Preeti said. "I need to confirm the total scope of misappropriated funds with complete documentation, ideally including formal statements from any vendors or financial institutions involved. This will take another week, perhaps 10 days. And then?" Grace answered this question. "Then we schedule a meeting. Not a casual conversation over the phone, but a formal meeting with Daniel and his attorney present, where we lay out everything we've discovered. At that point, Claire, you'll have significant leverage in negotiating a fair settlement, one that reflects not only equal division of legitimate marital assets, but also full accounting for the funds he diverted without your knowledge or consent." Claire nodded, though a part of her, the part that had loved Daniel for 15 years and built a family and a business alongside him, still struggled to fully accept the scale of the betrayal. She thought of their wedding day, of the early years struggling together to build the company, of countless small moments of partnership and trust that now felt like they belonged to a different, false version of her marriage. "I need to ask you something," Claire said quietly, looking at Grace. "Realistically, what happens to him? Legally, I mean beyond the divorce settlement." Grace considered the question carefully before answering. "That depends on choices you make going forward. If the misappropriated funds are returned as part of a negotiated settlement, and if you choose not to pursue a criminal complaint, this could potentially be resolved entirely through civil proceedings. If clients become aware that their fees were misused, or if you decide to pursue this through law enforcement, the consequences for Daniel could be significantly more severe, potentially including criminal fraud charges. What would you recommend? That's ultimately your decision to make, and it's a deeply personal one. Some of my clients in similar situations choose to pursue every possible legal consequence, driven by a need for the person who wronged them to face full accountability. Others prioritize a faster resolution that protects their business reputation and their family's privacy, particularly when children are involved. There's no universally correct answer here, Claire. I'll support whatever path you choose, but I want you to think carefully about what outcome will actually bring you peace, rather than simply focusing on what might bring him the most consequences. Claire sat with this thought during the drive home, turning it over carefully in her mind. She thought of Leo, of the impact a public criminal case might have on a 14-year-old boy already struggling to process his parents' separation. She thought of the company, of the employees like Henry who depended on Bennett and Associates for their livelihoods, and how a scandal involving fraud accusations might affect the business's reputation and its ability to retain clients. She also thought of herself, of the woman who had walked calmly out of that ballroom rather than giving Daniel the emotional scene he seemed to have expected and perhaps even wanted. She had built her entire response to this crisis around the principle of controlled, strategic action rather than reactive emotion. Pursuing the harshest possible consequences might feel satisfying in the moment, but she needed to consider whether it aligned with the kind of future she wanted to build for herself and her son. By the time she arrived home, Claire had reached a tentative conclusion, though she knew the final decision would depend partly on how Daniel responded once confronted with the full evidence against him. If he approached the coming negotiation with honesty and a genuine willingness to make things right, perhaps a civil resolution would serve everyone's interests best. If he continued attempting to minimize or deny what he had done, she would not hesitate to pursue every consequence available to her. That evening, after Leo had gone to bed, Claire sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, writing out her own version of the priorities she wanted Grace to pursue in the upcoming negotiation. Full and fair division of legitimate marital assets, complete restoration of the misappropriated company funds, her name remaining as majority or equal owner of Bennett and Associates, reflecting the years of work she had genuinely invested in building the business. Primary custody arrangements that protected Leo's stability and routine. And finally, though she hesitated slightly before writing it, some form of acknowledgement from Daniel, not necessarily legal but personal, of the harm he had caused, both to her and to the family they had built together. She folded the paper and set it aside, feeling, for the first time since the night of the dinner, a sense of forward momentum rather than simply reaction to events beyond her control. Daniel had spent months carefully constructing a plan designed to protect himself while dismantling their marriage on his own terms. Claire now possessed the knowledge and the resources to ensure that whatever happened next would happen on terms that were fair, transparent, and ultimately, entirely within her control. The final piece of evidence arrived 9 days later, when Preeti called to confirm that the total scope of misappropriated funds had reached $285,000, fully documented, and traced across 11 months of careful financial manipulation. Grace scheduled the formal meeting for the following week, informing Daniel's attorney that Claire would be presenting documentation related to significant financial irregularities within the company that required immediate discussion. Claire spent the days leading up to that meeting preparing herself mentally, reviewing every document with Grace, anticipating every possible reaction Daniel might have once confronted with the truth. She practiced remaining calm under pressure, drawing on the same discipline that had carried her through the ballroom weeks earlier, understanding that this meeting would likely be the most important conversation of her professional and personal life. Whatever Daniel had imagined when he stood before their friends and colleagues and announced the end of their marriage, he had not imagined this. He had not imagined that the woman he dismissed so publicly and so casually would emerge from that humiliation with a complete accounting of every dollar he had stolen, every lie he had told, and every piece of leverage necessary to ensure that he would answer for what he had done. The conference room Grace had chosen for the meeting sat on the 10th floor of a building neither Daniel nor Claire had any personal connection to. Neutral ground selected deliberately to avoid the emotional weight of familiar spaces. Claire arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a simple navy suit, her folder of documents organized in the same careful manner she once used for major client presentations. Grace met her in the lobby, offering a brief but steadying smile. "Remember, you don't need to say much today. I'll present the findings. Your job is simply to remain composed and let the evidence do the work." "I can do that," Claire said, and found she genuinely believed it. They took their seats at the long conference table a few minutes before the scheduled time. Daniel arrived shortly after, accompanied by an attorney Claire did not recognize, a middle-aged man named Frank Delgado who carried himself with the practiced neutrality of someone who handled difficult family law cases regularly. Daniel looked tired, Claire noticed, his usual polished confidence slightly diminished, though he still managed a brief nod in her direction as he took his seat across the table. "Thank you both for coming," Grace began, her tone professional and unhurried. "We're here today to discuss the terms of separation and business dissolution between Claire and Daniel Bennett, but before we begin that conversation, I need to present some findings that significantly impact how these negotiations should proceed." Frank Delgado leaned forward slightly. "We were told this meeting concerned financial irregularities. I'd like to understand what specifically is being alleged." Grace opened her own folder and began laying out documents across the table with practiced precision. Over the past 18 months, Bennett and Associates has made payments totaling $285,000 to an entity called Ridgeline Solutions, categorized in company records as consulting fees. Ridgeline Solutions was registered 11 months ago by Natalie Ashford, and our forensic accounting review has found no evidence that any legitimate consulting services were actually provided in exchange for these payments. Daniel's expression shifted, the practiced calm cracking slightly at the edges. He glanced at his attorney, who remained focused on the documents Grace continued to spread across the table. "Among these payments," Grace continued, $80,000 was traced directly to a down payment on a condominium purchased under Ms. Ashford's name, funded through an invoice falsely attributed to consulting work on the Meridian account, a client Claire personally helped secure and maintain over the past several years. Frank Delgado turned to Daniel, his expression tightening. "I need a moment with my client." "Take whatever time you need," Grace said evenly. "We're prepared to wait." The two men stepped into the hallway, and Claire sat in silence beside Grace, her heart pounding despite her outwardly composed posture. This was the moment she had been preparing for over the past 3 weeks, the moment when the careful, methodical work of building an undeniable case finally faced its first true test. When Daniel and his attorney returned, several minutes later, Daniel's face had lost most of its color. "I want to address this directly," Daniel said, his voice quieter than it had been. "The relationship with Natalie began without my planning it, and I handled the financial arrangements poorly. I take responsibility for that." "Poor handling of financial arrangements," Claire said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, "is not an accurate description of diverting nearly $300,000 in client and company funds to purchase real estate for the woman you were having an affair with." Frank Delgado raised a hand slightly. "My client is prepared to discuss a fair resolution regarding these funds. I want to be clear that we take this matter seriously and have no interest in prolonging unnecessary conflict." Grace nodded. "We appreciate that. Given the scope of what's been documented, Claire's position is straightforward. The misappropriated funds must be fully returned to the company, with appropriate interest calculated from the date of each transaction. Additionally, given that this misconduct occurred while Daniel maintained primary control over company finances, Claire's ownership stake in Bennett and Associates should be adjusted to reflect a controlling interest, ensuring she retains the ability to protect the company from any similar issues going forward." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You want me out of my own company?" "You remain a partner in the company," Grace clarified. "But given what's been documented, Claire's position is that she should hold majority ownership and primary decision-making authority regarding financial matters, at minimum for a defined period going forward. This is not unreasonable given the circumstances." The negotiation continued for nearly 2 hours, moving through details of the house, retirement accounts, and other shared assets, each point discussed with careful precision by the attorneys while Claire and Daniel sat mostly silent, occasionally exchanging brief, charged glances across the table. Claire noticed, throughout the discussion, that Daniel's earlier confidence had entirely evaporated, replaced by the cautious, deferential posture of someone who understood He no longer held the advantage he had believed himself to possess weeks earlier. At one point, during a brief pause while the attorneys reviewed a specific clause regarding retirement account division, Daniel looked directly at Claire for the first time since the meeting began. "I never meant for you to find out this way," he said quietly. "I never meant for any of this to happen the way it did." Claire studied him for a long moment before responding. "You planned an announcement in front of 200 people, Daniel. You planned it carefully enough to have Natalie standing beside you, dressed for the occasion. Nothing about that night happened by accident. I wanted it to be over quickly. I thought a clean break would be easier for everyone." "Easier for you," Claire corrected. "You wanted an audience that would prevent me from reacting the way you assumed I would, and you wanted to control how people understood what had happened between us before I had any chance to explain my own side of things. That's not the same as wanting things to be easier for everyone." Daniel had no response to this, and the meeting resumed its formal pace, moving through the remaining details with the attorneys carrying the bulk of the conversation. By the time they concluded, several hours later, a preliminary framework had emerged, one that would require additional review and formal drafting, but represented a significant step toward resolution. Daniel would return the full amount of misappropriated funds, with interest, structured as a repayment plan over 18 months given the scale of the amount involved. Claire would retain 60% ownership of Bennett and Associates, with Daniel retaining 40%, but relinquishing primary financial control, a role Claire would now assume with Henry Ackafer serving as an additional check on major financial decisions. The house would be sold, proceeds split according to standard marital asset division, with Claire and Leo remaining in the home until a suitable transition period concluded. Primary custody of Leo would rest with Claire, with Daniel retaining regular visitation, an arrangement both agreed served their son's best interests despite everything else that had unraveled between them. As the meeting concluded and documents were gathered, Frank Delgado pulled Grace aside briefly to discuss the criminal liability question that had hovered unspoken throughout the negotiation. Claire watched the two attorneys speak quietly near the door before Grace returned to where Claire sat gathering her own papers. "He asked whether you intend to pursue criminal charges related to the misappropriated funds," Grace said quietly. "Given his agreement to full restitution, that decision remains entirely yours to make." Claire considered this carefully, aware that Daniel stood nearby, watching her with an expression that mixed fear and something that might have been genuine remorse, though she found she could no longer easily distinguish authentic feeling from calculated performance where he was concerned. "I've thought about this a great deal," Claire said finally, addressing both Grace and, indirectly, Daniel himself. "I'm not going to pursue criminal charges, provided the full restitution agreement is honored completely and on schedule. I have a son who needs stability, and a company that needs to move forward without the shadow of a criminal investigation hanging over it. But if there is any deviation from the agreed repayment schedule, any attempt to hide additional assets, or any further irregularities discovered in company finances, I reserve the right to pursue every legal option available to me." Grace nodded, clearly having anticipated this decision, and relayed the terms formally to Frank Delgado, who conveyed obvious relief to his client. Daniel approached Claire briefly as the meeting concluded, the others giving them a small measure of privacy near the door. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not pursuing that." "I'm not doing this for you," Claire replied evenly. "I'm doing it for Leo and for myself. I don't want the next several years of my life defined by pursuing your punishment. I want them defined by building something better than what we had." Daniel absorbed this without response, and Claire turned and walked out of the conference room, Grace beside her, leaving behind the man who had once promised to build a life alongside her, and had instead spent the final year of their marriage systematically dismantling everything they had created together. Outside, standing on the sidewalk in the late afternoon sun, Grace turned to Claire with genuine warmth in her expression. You handled that better than most clients I've represented handle far less complicated situations. I want you to know that. I had good counsel, Claire said, managing a tired smile. You had good counsel and remarkable composure. Those don't always come together. Grace hesitated, then added, "What happens now?" Claire considered the question, looking out at the busy street, at people moving through their ordinary afternoons unaware of the significant turning point Claire had just navigated. Now I go pick up my son from school, and I figure out how to build whatever comes next. She thanked Grace warmly and walked toward her car, feeling something she had not expected to feel so soon after such a difficult confrontation. A genuine, quiet sense of relief. The worst of the uncertainty had passed. Whatever challenges remained ahead, rebuilding a business, rebuilding a home, rebuilding a sense of who she was outside the marriage that had defined so much of her adult life. She would face them with the same clarity and determination that had carried her through the past several weeks. Daniel had underestimated her once, standing in that ballroom believing his calm announcement and prepared narrative would leave her too broken to fight back. He would not make that mistake again, and more importantly, Claire realized as she drove toward Leo's school, she no longer needed him to understand or acknowledge her strength at all. She simply needed to keep moving forward, building the life she and her son deserved, one deliberate step at a time. The months that followed the settlement meeting brought a different kind of challenge, one less dramatic than the confrontation itself, but no less demanding. Claire discovered that rebuilding a life required 1,000 small decisions, each one seemingly minor on its own, but collectively forming the foundation of whatever came next. She began by focusing on the company, walking into the office each morning with a renewed sense of purpose that colleagues quickly noticed. Henry Ackhaffer, now serving alongside her and overseeing the financial operations, commented one afternoon that the company felt different, steadier somehow, though he struggled to articulate exactly why. "I think people can sense when someone is genuinely invested in doing things right," Claire told him, reviewing a quarterly report they had prepared together. Daniel was talented, but there was always a part of him focused on appearances, on how things looked rather than how they actually worked. "I want us to build something that doesn't need to hide behind appearances." Under Claire's expanded leadership, Bennett and Associates implemented new financial oversight procedures, multiple layers of review for any significant expenditure, transparent reporting shared quarterly with all senior staff, rather than concentrated in the hands of one or two people. Some employees initially found the changes cumbersome, accustomed to the more informal processes Daniel had preferred, but within a few months, the benefits became clear. Client trust in the company's stability actually increased, several longtime clients privately telling Claire they appreciated the new transparency, unaware of the full story behind the changes, but sensing the company had emerged from some internal transition stronger than before. At home, Claire and Leo settled into a new rhythm together. The house sale had gone through as agreed, and Claire had used her share of the proceeds. Along with a portion of the restitution funds Daniel continued paying according to the agreed schedule, to purchase a smaller but comfortable home in a neighborhood closer to Leo's school. The move had been difficult at first, Leo mourning the familiar bedroom and backyard he had known his entire life, but Claire made a point of involving him in every decision about their new space, letting him choose paint colors and furniture arrangements, giving him ownership over the transition in whatever small ways she could offer. Daniel maintained his scheduled visitation, picking Leo up most weekends, though Claire noticed a gradual shift in her son's relationship with his father over those months. Leo remained loving toward Daniel, unwilling to fully process the complicated reasons behind his parents' separation, but something had changed in the easy trust that once characterized their relationship. He asked more questions now, questions Claire answered carefully and honestly, without villainizing his father but without hiding the truth either, believing her son deserved an accurate understanding of his own family history, delivered in age-appropriate terms as he grew older and more capable of understanding complexity. "Dad made some really serious mistakes," Claire told him one evening, several months into their new routine, when Leo asked directly why his parents had really separated. He hurt people, including me, and he did some things with money that weren't honest. I'm not telling you this to make you think badly of him, because he's still your father and he still loves you. But I think you're old enough to understand that grown-ups sometimes make choices that hurt the people who trust them, and it's okay to feel complicated about that. Leo had absorbed this quietly, processing it in the way 14, and soon 15-year-olds often processed difficult truths, without dramatic reaction, but with a visible internal shift that Claire recognized as genuine understanding beginning to take root. Over the following weeks, she noticed him growing closer to her in small but meaningful ways, seeking her opinion on decisions, sharing details about his day that he might once have kept to himself, gravitating toward her steady presence as the one constant that had remained reliable throughout the upheaval of the past year. Megan remained a constant source of support throughout this period, checking in regularly, helping Claire navigate the countless small logistics of rebuilding a household and a sense of independent identity. During one particular evening, several months after the settlement, the two friends sat together in Claire's new living room, boxes still half unpacked around them, sharing a bottle of wine neither of them finished. "You know," Megan said, looking around at the modest but warm space Claire had created, "I keep waiting for you to fall apart. Everyone does eventually after something like this, but you just keep building." Claire considered this observation carefully. "I think I did fall apart in a way, just not in the way people expected. I fell apart privately, in small pieces, over weeks and months, instead of all at once in that ballroom. Maybe that was healthier, actually. I got to grieve the marriage I thought I had while also building something new, instead of losing myself completely to the grief before I could start rebuilding." "Do you regret not making more of a scene that night? Some people might have expected you to at least confront him publicly, given everything you found out afterward." Claire shook her head firmly. "No, if I had reacted the way he expected, the way everyone in that room probably expected, I would have given him exactly what he wanted. Instead, walking away calmly, thanking the host, leaving with my dignity intact, that unsettled him far more than any scene could have. It told him, without a single angry word, that I was not the woman he thought he could easily discard." Megan smiled, raising her glass slightly in a small, private toast, to not giving people the reaction they expect. Claire clinked her glass against her friend's, feeling a genuine warmth spread through her chest, the first moment in many months where she felt fully present in her own life, rather than simply managing crisis after crisis. Around this time, Claire also began reconnecting with parts of herself she had set aside during the busiest years of raising Leo and building the company alongside Daniel. She rediscovered an old interest in painting, taking a weekend class at a local community center, finding unexpected peace in the quiet concentration required to mix colors and shape images on canvas. She reconnected with old friends from her years before marriage, people she had lost touch with amid the demands of family and business, discovering that many of them welcomed her back into their lives with open warmth rather than judgment about her changed circumstances. Professionally, Claire's expanded role at Bennett and Associates led to opportunities she had not previously considered. A local business association invited her to speak on a panel about navigating corporate transitions and maintaining financial integrity during periods of organizational change, drawing on her experience, though she kept the most personal details private, sharing instead the practical lessons she had learned about transparency, careful documentation, and the importance of trustworthy financial oversight. The panel led to further speaking opportunities, and Claire found herself building a small but growing reputation as a thoughtful voice on business ethics and financial governance, an unexpected outcome from the darkest period of her personal life. Daniel, for his part, continued meeting his obligations under the settlement agreement, the restitution payments arriving on schedule each month, his role at the company gradually diminishing as Claire and Henry took on increasing responsibility for its direction. Claire heard through mutual acquaintances that his relationship with Natalie had grown strained under the weight of financial pressure and public scrutiny, the fairy tale beginning he had staged at that anniversary dinner, apparently failing to translate into the stable new life he had envisioned. Claire found she felt little satisfaction in this information when it reached her, neither triumph nor renewed anger, simply a quiet acknowledgement that people often built their futures on foundations that could not support the weight of what they had constructed. She had chosen, from the earliest days after the confrontation, to focus her energy on building her own foundation rather than monitoring the collapse of the one Daniel had chosen for himself. As the one-year anniversary of that fateful dinner approached, Claire found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed, and how much of that change, despite beginning in such painful circumstances, had ultimately led her toward a stronger, more authentic version of herself than the one who had walked into that ballroom believing she was simply attending an anniversary celebration. She thought about the version of herself who had sat frozen in her seat as Daniel made his announcement, who had gathered herself with quiet dignity and walked out without giving him the reaction he expected. That woman, Claire realized, had already possessed the strength required for everything that followed, even if she had not fully recognized it in that moment of shock and heartbreak. The composure had not been an act. It had been the first genuine expression of a resilience that had been building within her for years, waiting for the moment it would be truly tested. Leo, now approaching his 16th birthday, had grown into a thoughtful young man who spoke with increasing maturity about his parents' separation, understanding it now not as a simple tragedy, but as a complicated chapter in his family's story, one that had ultimately led to a healthier, more honest relationship with his mother, even as his relationship with his father remained cautiously rebuilding on new and more transparent terms. Claire's new home had become genuinely comfortable, filled with paintings she had created herself, photographs of just herself and Leo, alongside a few carefully chosen images from before the marriage's collapse, evidence of a life being built with the same careful intention she had once applied to spreadsheets and business plans. The garden she had planted in the small backyard had begun to flourish, tomatoes and herbs she tended most evenings after work, finding unexpected satisfaction in watching things grow under her patient care. As she stood in that garden one evening, watching the sun set over her small but genuinely hers backyard, Claire allowed herself to feel something she had not expected to feel again so soon after such devastating betrayal. Genuine hope for the future, built not on anyone else's promises, but on her own demonstrated capacity to rebuild whatever life required of her. 1 year to the day after the anniversary dinner that had ended her marriage in front of 200 witnesses, Claire stood in the small backyard of her new home, arranging string lights along the fence, while Leo helped set up folding tables borrowed from Megan's garage. She had decided, somewhat impulsively when the date first appeared on her calendar weeks earlier, that she wanted to mark this particular evening not with dread or avoidance, but with a gathering of her own, one built entirely on her own terms. The guest list was small and carefully chosen, nothing like the sprawling corporate event that had once defined this date in her memory. Megan arrived first, carrying a dish of roasted vegetables and a bottle of wine, greeting Claire with the easy affection of someone who had witnessed every stage of the past year's transformation. Henry Acaffer came next, bringing his wife, Adiz, whom Claire had grown close to over recent months through company gatherings that felt increasingly like family rather than obligation. Grace Whitfield arrived shortly after, having become, somewhat unexpectedly, a genuine friend rather than simply legal counsel, the two women having discovered shared interests beyond the business that first brought them together. A handful of other guests filled out the small gathering. 2 colleagues from the community painting class Claire had continued attending, a woman named Priya's mother whom Claire had befriended, while their children carpooled to school events, and a few employees from Bennett and Associates who had become close friends over the demanding but ultimately rewarding year of rebuilding the company's culture and financial practices. As the evening progressed, string lights glowing warmly against the darkening sky, laughter and easy conversation filling the small backyard, Claire found herself reflecting on the dramatic contrast between this gathering and the one that had unfolded exactly 1 year earlier. That night had been about appearances, about a carefully staged performance designed to control a narrative and minimize consequences for the person who orchestrated it. Tonight was about something entirely different: genuine connection, hard-won stability, and a life rebuilt through her own deliberate effort rather than inherited from someone else's plans. Leo moved comfortably among the adults, now 16 and remarkably poised for his age, helping refill drinks and manage the small portable speaker playing music low enough for conversation. Claire watched him with quiet pride, recognizing in his confident, easy manner the results of a year spent modeling resilience and honesty for him, even during the most difficult moments of processing their family's transformation. Around 8 in the evening, as the sky deepened into full darkness and the string lights took on their full warm glow, Henry raised his glass and called for everyone's attention, a mischievous smile on his face that suggested he had been planning this moment. "I know this isn't exactly how these things usually work," he said, "but I've been given permission to say a few words, so I'm taking the opportunity." Claire laughed, caught off guard, glancing toward Megan, who was grinning with obvious complicity, clearly having coordinated this small surprise in advance. "A year ago," Henry continued, "some of us watched something happen that none of us will ever forget. I won't go into details, because most of us here already know the story and the rest of us have heard enough to understand the shape of it. What I want to say is this: I have never, in all my years working alongside Claire, seen anyone handle devastating circumstances with more grace, more genuine strength, and more unwavering commitment to doing right by the people around her, especially her son." Claire felt her eyes sting slightly, an unexpected wave of emotion rising as Henry continued. "The company is stronger today because of decisions Claire made during the hardest months of her life. Our clients trust us more. Our internal culture is healthier. And beyond the business, I've watched a friend rebuild an entire life from the ground up, not through anger or bitterness, but through quiet, determined effort, day after day. I think that deserves recognition, and I think it deserves a toast." Glasses rose around the small gathering, warm applause following Henry's words, and Claire found herself momentarily unable to speak, overwhelmed by the genuine warmth surrounding her, so different from the cold, calculated performance she had endured exactly 1 year earlier in that grand hotel ballroom. When she finally found her voice, she raised her own glass and looked around at the faces gathered in her backyard, people who had supported her through the most difficult chapter of her adult life, people who had chosen to stand beside her not out of obligation, but out of genuine friendship and respect. "A year ago tonight," Claire began, her voice steady despite the emotion coloring it, "someone stood up in a room full of people and told me I was no longer the person he needed. At the time, I thought that moment would define the worst chapter of my life. I understand now that it actually marked the beginning of discovering exactly who I am when everything I thought I could rely on disappears." She paused, looking briefly at Leo, who watched her with quiet, proud attention. "I learned that dignity doesn't require anger. I learned that strength often looks like calm, deliberate action rather than dramatic confrontation. I learned that the people who truly matter in your life reveal themselves not during the easy times, but during the difficult ones, and I have been fortunate enough to be surrounded by exactly those people throughout this past year." She looked around at Megan, at Grace, at Henry and Adiz, at the small collection of friends who had become her genuine foundation over the past 12 months. "I don't know what the next year will bring, but I know I'm not facing it as someone diminished by what happened. I'm facing it as someone who discovered, in the hardest possible way, exactly how much strength I had all along. So thank you, all of you, for reminding me of that, and for standing beside me while I figured it out." The gathering raised their glasses together, a warm chorus of agreement and affection filling the small backyard, so different from the shocked silence that had once filled a much grander room exactly 1 year earlier. Claire felt something settle within her in that moment, a sense of genuine peace she had not fully expected to reach so completely, so soon after such profound betrayal. Later that evening, after most guests had departed and only Megan remained, helping Claire clear the last of the dishes from the folding tables. The two friends sat together on the back steps, looking up at the stars visible above the quiet neighborhood. "You did it," Megan said simply, resting her head briefly against Claire's shoulder. "You actually built something good out of all of that." "I had help," Claire replied, gesturing vaguely toward the emptied backyard, toward the memory of the friends who had just filled it with warmth and support. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." "Maybe not alone, but you're the one who chose to build instead of just survive. That's not nothing, Claire. Most people would have spent this year falling apart or plotting revenge or just barely getting through each day. You built an entire new life." Claire considered this, looking out at the small garden she had planted, at the string lights still glowing softly overhead, at the home that had become genuinely hers over the past 12 months. "I think I finally understand something I didn't understand a year ago. Daniel didn't take anything from me that night, not really. He revealed something. He showed me exactly what our marriage had actually become, and as painful as that revelation was, it gave me the chance to build something more honest in its place." "Any regrets?" Claire thought about this seriously before answering. "I regret not seeing it sooner, maybe. I regret 12 years spent believing in a partnership that wasn't as equal or as honest as I thought. But I don't regret how I responded once I knew the truth. I don't regret walking out of that ballroom with my dignity intact instead of giving him the scene he wanted. And I definitely don't regret everything I've built since then." Megan smiled and squeezed her friend's hand gently. "To dignity, then, and to everything you've built since." Claire smiled back, feeling the last lingering weight of that painful anniversary finally lift completely from her shoulders. Somewhere across the city, Daniel continued living whatever life he had chosen for himself, the consequences of his own decisions unfolding according to their own logic, no longer requiring Claire's attention or energy. She had spent a year proving, quietly and deliberately, that being told she was no longer needed had not diminished her at all. It had simply revealed how much she had always been capable of building on her own, and how little she had actually needed anyone else's validation to discover her own genuine strength. As Megan finally said goodnight and drove away, Claire walked back into her home, checking briefly on Leo, already asleep after a long evening helping host the gathering, before returning to her own quiet bedroom. She stood for a moment by the window, looking out at the string lights still glowing softly in the backyard below, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, a genuine and complete sense of peace. Whatever came next in her life, whatever new challenges or opportunities awaited her, Claire understood now that she would face them the same way she had faced this past difficult year. With quiet strength, careful thought, and an unshakable commitment to building a life defined entirely by her own choices, rather than by anyone else's judgment of her worth. 3 years passed, and the life Claire had rebuilt from the wreckage of that anniversary dinner continued to grow steadier and more genuinely her own with each passing season. Bennett and Associates had grown substantially under her expanded leadership. The transparent financial practices she implemented after Daniel's misconduct becoming something of a model that other small companies in the region began studying and adopting. Claire had even been invited to contribute to a regional business journal, writing a series of articles on ethical financial governance for family-owned companies, work that felt deeply meaningful given everything she had personally experienced and overcome. Leo, now 19 and in his second year of college studying environmental engineering, called his mother every Sunday evening, sharing details about his coursework, his new friendships, and occasionally his continuing, carefully managed relationship with his father. Daniel had eventually completed his full restitution payments, the final installment arriving precisely on schedule nearly 2 years after the initial settlement, and had gradually rebuilt a smaller, more modest life for himself, his relationship with Natalie having ended within the first 18 months, unable to withstand the financial and emotional pressures that had first brought them together under such compromised circumstances. Claire felt no particular satisfaction in learning of Daniel's diminished circumstances. Nor did she feel any lingering bitterness that colored her interactions with him during the occasional exchanges necessary for coordinating aspects of Leo's life. She had, somewhere during the past 3 years, arrived at a genuine and hard-won peace regarding the entire chapter of her life that had once seemed destined to define her permanently. Daniel remained simply a person from her past now, someone whose choices had once caused tremendous pain, but who no longer held any real power over her sense of self or her vision for the future. Her personal life had also continued evolving in ways she had not anticipated during those first difficult months of rebuilding. She had begun dating again eventually, cautiously and on her own timeline, eventually developing a genuine and comfortable relationship with a man named Julian Marsh, an architect she had met through the same community painting class that had first reawakened her interest in creative pursuits. Their relationship moved slowly and deliberately, built on the kind of transparency and mutual respect Claire had learned, through painful experience, to consider non-negotiable in any partnership she chose to pursue. Grace Whitfield remained a close friend, the two women meeting regularly for dinner, their friendship having long since outgrown its original professional origins. Megan, of course, remained the constant presence she had always been, still living nearby, still available for late-night phone calls and impromptu visits whenever life presented new challenges or celebrations worth sharing. On a warm evening in early autumn, exactly 4 years after the anniversary dinner that had once seemed like the ending of everything Claire valued, she stood once again in her backyard, this gathering larger than the modest one from 3 years earlier, celebrating both Leo's upcoming return from his study abroad semester and the launch of a new community initiative Claire had helped organize, providing financial literacy education to small business owners throughout the region. Drawing directly on everything she had learned during her own difficult journey toward financial independence and business integrity. Standing amid friends old and new, watching her son, now a confident young man, laughing easily with Julian near the garden she had tended faithfully for years, Claire allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection on the distance she had traveled since that painful night in the hotel ballroom. The woman who had calmly thanked the host and walked away that evening had not yet fully understood the strength she carried within her, had not yet recognized that composure in the face of devastating betrayal was not simply survival, but the very foundation upon which an entirely new and more authentic life could be built. She thought sometimes, in quiet moments, about the version of the story that continued circulating occasionally among old acquaintances and former colleagues, the dramatic tale of the wife who walked away from public humiliation with unshakable dignity, only to uncover a hidden fraud and emerge stronger than anyone could have predicted. It had become, in certain circles, something of a legend, retold and embellished slightly with each new telling, though Claire herself rarely felt the need to correct or elaborate on the details. The truth of what she had built since that night mattered far more to her than the story others chose to tell about its beginning. What mattered most, standing in her garden that autumn evening surrounded by genuine connection and hard-won peace, was the undeniable fact that she had transformed devastating betrayal into an entirely new foundation for her life, built not on anyone else's promises or plans, but on her own demonstrated capacity for resilience, integrity, and quiet, unshakable strength. Daniel had once declared, in front of 200 witnesses, that she was no longer the person he needed. Standing now in the life she had built entirely on her own terms, Claire understood with complete clarity that she had never actually needed his validation at all. She had simply needed the chance to discover, through the hardest possible circumstances, exactly who she truly was when everything she once relied upon disappeared. And in that discovery, she had found something far more valuable than anything Daniel had ever offered her. A life defined entirely by her own strength, her own choices, and her own unwavering commitment to building something genuine, no matter how difficult the path required to reach it. As the evening deepened into night, string lights glowing warmly overhead once more, laughter and easy conversation filling the space around her, Claire raised her glass quietly to herself, a private toast that needed no audience and no witnesses beyond her own certain understanding of everything she had overcome and everything she had built in its place. Whatever chapters remained ahead in her life, she would face them the same way she had faced every challenge since that fateful anniversary dinner, with calm, deliberate strength and an unshakable knowledge of exactly who she was, entirely on her own terms.